So the goal here is really like to define a little bit more like how, what is responsible design, and dig deep in there, and then also how can we really apply that in our daily work and move forward there. So I welcome really here my panel with different people on there. Like Kenneth, who is a designer and also like wrote a book on tech ethics. And like Future Ethics is a must read actually. If you haven't read it, go and buy it and read it. Maybe he still signs it when he's around. And he works now with organizations to really like implement the theory and really build the capabilities here. Then, a big applause for Kenneth to be here. I think. The next to Kenneth, there's Jordan, who studies at Harvard MIT about how to implement like ethics into the medical field and also in brain-machine connections. And next to that, she has a really nice YouTube channel, Everyday AI, where she explains really like the implications of AI. So go there, watch it. I think there's really loads to learn, and I really like learn tons of things when I watched it. So also welcome, Jordan. And there's Michelle, who works at Facebook Oculus and is also teaching creative technology next to that one. And she works really like how to make the virtual space more safe. And hopefully we're gonna hear more about that one in a minute. And yes, thanks to her, your virtual reality experience will be much better than it might have been. Thank you for being here. What is also very nice about Michelle is that she uses the rubber hand experiment as an example of how embodiment works. And for me, the rubber hand experiment was in my psychology studies one of the points where I thought about going towards more VR and consciousness, because I found it so amazing, and it's just like mind shifting how the mind works, and there's so much potential in there. But I ended up then more in politics and activism, but I'm happy to be fully back in technology again and having those discussions now as well about what is responsible design and how to move that forward. As a first starting point, like, what's your definition of responsible design that we really like have some common ground what we talk about? Who wants to?
I can kick it off. I think to be as simple as possible about it, it's trying to wrap your head around the repercussions or possible spin-offs of a technology that you are designing or creating before it happens. It's just any kind of foresight that you can possibly have, which, as we've seen in the last few years of technology, is very important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I also think it's having those thoughts about ethics and repercussions even when you're like in the ideation process, before you've even built the thing, before you're kind of getting it to market. Just thinking about, I have an idea, and does this idea both make sense in terms of, should I do this because I have the resources, but also should I do this based on what I think might happen if I do it?
Yeah, and to second that and maybe to extend it, I think for me, responsible design, responsible technology is about trying to mitigate unintended consequences where possible. It's also about trying to understand externalities, because I think designers have for far too long focused on a very narrow cohort of the actors who are actually affected by technology. So it's trying to mitigate both of those potential harms. And then it's about being a good steward of technology today to create better futures. So this idea of essentially having ancestor thinking of what happens over a longer lifespan of technologies and the social impacts over not just months, but years and decades to come.
So not just mitigating, but really creating the future we want to have and be in there. That's a very like designer perspective. Are there like other perspectives? Like, I don't know, are you all designers in here? Who is a designer in here? Okay, woo! Like a third of there. Who is more like academics, research? What's that? Research, have we had journalists? Anyone? No, developers? 1?
2, 3.
2, 3. What is the other third who didn't raise their hands?
Shy.
Shy?
Just yell it out.
No, yell it. Teacher?
Product.
Product management, okay.
Government.
Government?
Research.
Research? Anything else? No? Okay, good. Does it resonate, this definition of responsible design for you also, where you come from your perspective? Like 1/3 is designer, and I think here it resonates a lot, but like from research and from government, what's your definition of responsible design? Does it add up? Is it different?
Not dissimilar.
Not dissimilar? It's the same. Any other one? All similar?
Yeah, we in research specifically participatory action research, and so how do you involve community in those decisions for responsibility and what responsibility means for them.
I think with the early ethos of Silicon Valley being move fast and break things, that doesn't really work with making things for human beings. So it's just a mismatch.
So there should be more intent in there and how to do that. Designing more intentfully and really trying out and learning from other spaces. Michelle, you did some really nice work in terms like looking what has been done in the past and how can we apply that one. Do you want to talk a bit more like what you did and why you did it?
Yeah, sure. So I recently, with a coworker, kind of banded together on our own time, like outside of our work designing VR at Facebook, we started to write a book chapter that was about how to use the ideology of sexual consent to design safer virtual spaces after reacting to a lot of harassment, specifically sexual harassment that was happening inside of social VR. And a lot of that comes from like a general feeling that even when we're working in nascent mediums that we don't feel like we have all the answers and we don't feel like we can predict all the outcomes. There is always like a deep well of information that has existed in the past to grab from and pull and sort of use as something to take inspiration from. Like in that case, we looked at kind of two things. We built a framework out of Edward T. Hall's research on proxemics, which is like sort of space-based theory, kind of like the regions of distance from the body can affect the types of codes of conduct, things that can happen. And then we looked at consent acquisition paradigms in the real world and tried to bring all of that stuff into each and every one of those types of spaces in social virtual reality. And that was just like an example of how we can look at things in the past, like that, the Edward T. Hall research is from the 1960s, and bring it into the present and the future and try to like foster problems that don't seem solvable with solutions that already exist.
How did you get to that point that you picked that and that you want to?
Which point? The point of using old stuff for new stuff, or the like literally the core of the
core that might be an issue and that it should be solved, and like what the obstacles came along like when you tried to solve it?
It was actually really a personal thing in that I had a couple instances where my like assault-based PTSD had been really badly triggered through some experiences in social VR where people had gotten too close or I was getting harassed. Pretty much social VR takes like the standard internet troll and like puts it right up in your space. Like I describe it as like, what if YouTube comments could chase you? That's bad. Clearly it's terrible. So we were like, I was very inclined to do something about that. I found myself in a lot of critiques with male coworkers who just like weren't getting why this was a problem, why this was a triggering experience. So I teamed up with this coworker and was like, hey, I have this idea that the ideology of sexual consent can be used for this exact purpose, that we can look at consent in the real world and we can bring it into the virtual world. And she was like, hell yeah, I have this framework that I've been looking at from Edward T. Hall. Let's come together and let's do this. And that's pretty much just how it happened. It was like, I got tired of explaining why something was a problem to people who didn't get it and was like, I'm just gonna turn it into research.
That's great, that's nice. Looking into the responsible design, like zooming out, there are real life issues which really like we translate into like virtual reality, into the machines we build. What's your perspective on like what those machines or those systems should do? Like how much should we build our ideology in there? How much shall we like design for safety? Like looking into the future, like Kenneth, you also said like we have to think much more about like how the future could look like. So like how do you see those systems, technology which moves at the core of society, how do you see those systems? Where should they support us and where should they really stay out of our human connection and interaction?
Well, it's sort of a political question to an extent. I think the angle I increasingly find myself looking at things from is that designers need to look at the future, or futures plural, as a constructive design material. I think designers have kind of box themselves into a corner where they're very well equipped to design the artifacts of the future, and they're also equipped to design the future of artifacts, but they're not very good at actually helping to mediate what that future looks like. And if we don't take an active stance in that, then we miss opportunities to try and make better futures. So for me, I see a lot of work in like speculative design and critical design that is more constructive in those spaces, and I'm really interested in bringing some of that into technology firms who have the power to execute on it. The downside, the risk within all of that is that then it becomes essentially an imposition of my preferred technological future on society, and we've had enough of that within Silicon Valley. We don't need more privileged, young, affluent technologists in the Bay Area saying this is how the world ought to be. So I want us to be more constructive in shaping futures, but I want that to be a participatory experience. I want to build, I call it temporal literacy among the general public, so that they're able to better visualize what the future might look like, but then to help the public take decisions about that, to engage a wider set of actors in that conversation, so that we can take better democratic and not technocratic decisions about how that future comes about.
And will that be only in the designing phase, in the first element, or does that go into your final products? Because when we build products nowadays, it's more about that they're frictionless and you would nudge people in the right direction, you would choose the right defaults, which you engage you more. So when does this participatory process end, and how much does it go into the real products?
Well, so as a designer, of course, I think design is the most important phase. And I think it's where a lot of the constructive and ethical and moral forces actually come into play. Product would say that it's a product management decision, fine. But I disagree. Design should help lead, or should probably lead that, I think. But it has to have greater buy-in from tech firms throughout disciplines. It has to be seen as something of value to product management. It has to be something that engineers are willing to partner with people. QA testers. I was at a QA testing conference on Tuesday talking about ethics. They're actually quite interested in this sort of stuff. So it does have to be interdisciplinary, but someone has to take the lead. And so let's stick our hands up and say design can do that.
What's your perspective, Jordan? Where should tech go in there? Where should it be out? Like from a more AI perspective, which really like we just had in the other panel, like, hey, there's the data scientists, and we are very disconnected from the individual person, which was like an argument against this Hippocratic oath, because you have like 2 million data points, and somehow we need to make that connection much closer because your decisions really impact so many people. So where can you impact people, and where should you really like be more hands-off?
Yeah, I mean, coming at it from an academic perspective, I think that I definitely agree that the incentive structures around driving people to incorporate ethics into the design process and development process just needs to happen. I think that we're starting to see that a little bit in academia with, the NSF and the NIH actually incorporating like ethics and broader impacts into whether or not you are awarded funding for a particular project. And so I think that that's a really good shift that we're starting to see. But I think, especially from an academic perspective, I definitely think that people should be, average people who are going to be affected by this should be involved way earlier in the process than we're seeing now. For my discipline, I work in essentially brain-machine interfaces and deep learning for pain and anesthesia in clinical settings. And so we see a lot of, clinical trial work, very, very early on work where the patient feedback isn't necessarily the thing that is prioritized in the development of the systems that we're making. And that's an area where I could definitely see, does this treatment work isn't necessarily as important as does the patient feel better at the end of it, because that's not the same question. So I guess that's my take on it.
Nice. When we really we agree that there should be an earlier participation in there, but I think in this move fast, break things, the agile process really being in there, quick time, fast time to market, and there's this pressure from the organizations really to be in there, and they might not measure the right things, but what's your experience in really like implementing those elements, and what are the responses in the organizations, and how to overcome those? Well, can you have some?
You do have a fundamental ideological clash here. Agile and lean methodologies are no longer methodologies. They are so pervasive that they are ideologies. They are mentalities, perspectives. And they stem from essentially scientism. There's a sort of perception that this is the imposition of the scientific method onto design. And I would say anyone who believes that design is a science doesn't understand design and probably doesn't understand science either. So you have this, you have this sort of deeply held belief that this is now the only valid way to build software. Waterfall is so antique and so slow and so on. But we have to find a way to bring more precautionary thinking into environments that have lean and agile mentalities. Where I find the most traction on this is, so you can have a conversation about values up front. Values are a good framing for this sort of stuff. The value-sensitive design process that I'm sure a few of you are familiar with. There are bits in that I found people in tech understand, but only bits. But the other thing is you can still retain this idea of iterative design and development. You just move the gate of where you actually ship, right? So at the moment, under lean and agile, you ship an MVP, a minimum viable product, basically the worst piece of crap that you can get, out of the door, and then you see what the implications are. And if that involves ethical harm, then that's a real problem, right? You can't put the pieces back together in the same way you can if it's just a photo interface you've broken, right? If it's democracy you've broken, that's a bigger issue. So you can still do this iteration, but you just say, and we're not going to actually ship until we're sure we've mitigated as many harms as we possibly can. So the business still feels like it's bringing that iterative, scientific, sort of validatory perspective, but you aren't throwing out quite as many potential harms into the market. The sophisticated teams will see through that and say, well, you're just trying to piggyback this, but actually take out one of its most central elements, which is you get immediate feedback from the market, which is true, but I didn't say that.
And that's like how designers can work in there, but quite often I have the feeling that like in the design process it's well designed and it solves those issues, but the problems come in when it really grows, when it becomes big, when you scale it to other markets, and then the designer is not really involved in this process anymore, but it's just like it's the marketing team, it's other people. So how to do that more intentional, or how?
Dan Saffo, who's a friend of mine, says something about at design school we're all taught what happens, to design what happens when you push this button, right? That's the key of interaction design, is how does a system respond to input. What we're not taught is to consider what happens if 1 billion people push this button. So design has to become more interwoven into consequences. It has to be in the consequence business, not the interaction business or the artifact business. And for me, that's about not necessarily assuming more power, but trying to weave your way into those organizational capacities and getting closer to your marketing teams, getting closer to your testers, etc. And that usually means staffing up design more as well.
I think there's another dimension to that also that isn't just like the what happens when you press this button, what happens when 1 billion people press this button, that isn't just like that sort of quantitative dimension, but there's a qualitative dimension that people often ignore, which is what does it feel like when X person presses this button versus what does it feel like when Y person presses this button, and all of those dimensions of feeling that are often just significantly ignored. Like we just look at data and we're like, yeah, these things are happening. Not necessarily why are they happening, how are they happening, whom are they happening to.
Especially when you go into there, like what's connected, we already talked about values, and I think what's missing in data is also the values, the intents of the people using it. And I think like with technology, we move into so many different communities, we are in touch with so many different people that have different intents, different goals, different values. But how do we design like software where there's this expectation that you have like one piece of software which you can really scale to so many people, which really helps one community with some values, but really like might be in conflict with different values from other communities. How do you make those trade-offs? How do you navigate the values which are there? And that's like a question which we have since a very, very long time. But like with software and with those embedded systems where we manipulate systems, it just becomes much more obvious. Does anyone have some idea on that one?
That question went real deep. It took a lot of turns.
To look at the different values. Like to make it simpler, like maybe one question is before that, like really like what's the role of like technology when it comes to an individual? Like where should technology be really like a extension, and where will it be really like a replacement of different things? Maybe that's a different perspective. That's already a first decision where we impose technology on a person. Where would you say?
I think it should always aim to be an extension of anything that we might have. It's like an augmentation of our lives. When it starts replacing things, things become dangerous. There are instances where that almost makes sense, like the idea that like Google, in a sense, can be a surrogate brain for me. It's all the things that I kind of know, but I don't remember, and I can look them up whenever I want to. And that's a kind of okay replacement because it's like in the span of things that my brain can't actually do, and no one's like, my brain can't remember all that stuff, and nobody's can. But in terms of like our everyday usages, technology should always aim itself to be an extension, or else we're getting into like weird gray areas where we're replacing aspects of our lives that we don't really know the repercussions of replacing those aspects of our lives.
If I can chip in something on that, though, I'm reminded of Marshall McLuhan, who says that every extension is also an amputation. So it's actually quite hard to take those away. If you do augment or extend human capabilities in some way, then a lot of the time the biological or the neurological practice or the habitual practice tends to wither as a result.
Which would mean, like, when you really go in there, we should really, like, maybe not really move into this social interaction, social systems, because the more we move technology in there, the more we become unable to interact with each other and to have those systems, maybe, or we become more dependent on those and also on things when they go wrong.
But I'm just going to play devil's advocate on that one. If you do have a social system that is like a social virtual reality system where you are essentially like having an embodied, speech-based, like body-based experience with multiple other real people scattered across the world, like is that more or less innately social? Does that take away my social abilities? Like I actually still have to do things like make eye contact, move my hands, talk with my voice, like have responses in real time. Like arguably, it's the same. But also arguably it's just another barrier.
Like going deeper, I think when it's intentionally designed to go there, I think there is the notion to do that where it might become tricky, and we see that maybe already like with navigation, with spell checker, with other stuff. I think there's no inherent motivation of Google to get you off of the navigation system. I think many people use navigation to get around, and there's some use cases in there, and people who are really good in navigating, the more you use it, after some time you realize there's some insecurity if you don't use it, so you use it more. And I think in the design itself, there's no incentive to design it differently, that you really learn to navigate better. And there comes, I guess, the business model in there of the intention is to really help us and to get off technology as well. But the business case is really more like to hook us and to connect us. How would you say to balance that paradox in terms of?
I mean, in the medical community, there's been a lot of interesting debates on the role of things like VR in education, because, when you want to teach someone how to do a surgery, you don't necessarily want their first time to be on an actual person, because that could go very badly. But at the same time, there are aspects of surgery or surgical procedures that you just cannot otherwise replicate without using an actual person. And so, the business case isn't necessarily something that's discussed as much because you're already paying a god-awful amount of money to go to medical school. But it's an interesting debate over whether or not, whether if you do this VR training to go through surgery and you come out of it, do you have those same skills? Is this really extending your ability to do this surgery? Or on some level, has it reduced your competency because you haven't actually interacted with a human, and you haven't, learned the nuance, the clinical gestalt is what it's often referred to as, that goes along with that more hands-on experience. Yeah.
Any other thoughts of any? Do you see like that's very theoretically very in there, and that's like about the responsible design? Have you like examples where you have the feeling that like, hey, that was really well intended and that was really well done in terms of, hey, that's responsible design. That's really like the theory put into practice. You've got any examples you have seen?
Anything?
Of anything, yeah, just like some light horses. I mean, we talk about the issue, but I think it's nice to have also like some things to look up to.
It frightens me that I don't have an immediate, actually. Like, it's such a disturbing state of design that I'm like, there's no like, this is the perfect example, look at this.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that people have asked me a few times over the last few years, and I've still not got a good answer. What I see is I think some companies do very well in certain slices, certain verticals of ethical, responsible technology, but mostly where it gives them a strategic benefit to do so. So you look at Apple on privacy, they've doubled down on privacy, they've been quite public about their stance on privacy, and they're continuing to do that. That's also very helpful for their marketing and for their value proposition, particularly to make Android and Facebook look deficient on that. No, I know actually Google are working damn hard on privacy, but they are behind partly because that strategy credit essentially that Apple have had. So I've yet to see companies really adopt overarching responsible design frameworks just in certain verticals that happen to benefit them really.
Somebody from the audience has seen or heard of good examples. I mean, that's a good chance to learn. Yeah. Anyone?
Yeah.
Ruben.
I might shift the frame. I'm curious about how people think about maturity models when it comes to responsibility and ethics in organizations. I know it's probably different across different kinds of principles, but like, how do we think about like, oh, we're thinking about the interactions, to like, oh, we're thinking about the incentives, to we're thinking about how we cast our vision, how we frame the direction of organizations, things of that nature.
Any thoughts? I'm where I don't want to dominate, so please.
Yeah, I'm trying to just frame that question a little bit more. Can you rephrase?
Oh, yeah, so we talk about like organizational maturity when it comes to design, right? Mm-hmm. Like where it's like, we're designing this thing, there's one-off engaging design to do this thing, to like, okay, now design as a capability, to, okay, now we have a process that sits over how things are being designed and what's involved in like the research and consideration, as we think about, what's the right problem to solve, and then, how to solve it the right way. I'm curious if you guys have thoughts on how we should be thinking about the maturity of responsibility in organizations, and is there a way to...
And accountability, I guess, as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that about how to get to a effective process for any specific company that involves responsible design, or is it more about like what to do once we've gotten there?
It's more about how do we think about organizations at different, the sort of like crawl, walk, run.
Well, if I may, I'll chip in on that. What I'm seeing now is there is now baseline ethical awareness in every tech company, right? Mostly because they know they will get, hauled over the coals by the press and by the public. Should they make sort of Uber Grable, Cambridge Analytica sort of levels of screw up in future? But there's very little sophistication within those companies about, okay, how do we talk about responsibility and ethics? How do we evaluate moral harm? How do we weigh up what may seem like politically divided perspectives on free speech, for example? These companies really don't have the literacy in moving beyond that. It's an awareness. but no competence beyond that, if you like. There are some exceptions. They tend to be the very large firms, from my experience. And the other thing that's the wild card in this is employee collective action, which is essentially forcing that issue to the fore. A lot of these companies are saying, okay, ethics matters, great, well, we'll put out a document, or we'll appoint a chief ethics officer or something like that, or we'll have a CSR statement. But employee mobilization is what's really driving the conversation forward in these companies, in my experience.
That is something I wanted to touch on. So it's like, I do feel like sometimes the top level, I mean, obviously, this is a weird thing. I'm a person who works at Facebook who is on this panel. Like, I get that. I get why that's weird. But there is a lot, and I can vouch for the ground level mobilization. Like, I am currently one of those people. I am very excited about that, and I do think that there's a lot of like good, that I see more active, real change and real like fundamental understanding that is pushing forward through different little grassroots movements all across the company that are like this, where like small select groups of people are saying, I understand this dimension of the product really well. I know this space. I understand how to make this space better, and I'm going to push forward my vision for making this better. And it is kind of happening in silos. So a little bit unfortunate. I feel like the amount of time it'll take to actually make that get to the top is probably a long time. But I really believe in all of these little micro movements all across here, and I can only imagine that if this is happening at a place like Facebook, it's happening at Google, it's happening at Apple, it's happening everywhere else.
And I think the form of that and the power of those groups will depend partly on the culture of the organization. One of the reasons employee collective action has been so successful at Google is because it is loosely federated. You can have quite a lot of power over a particular area without having to be, a senior director or a principal or whatever it is. So it's easier to do that. I get the impression Facebook's a little bit more hierarchical, a bit more centralized than Google, for example. But then,
it's quite bottom up. That's its intent. Right. Although I'm in the weird dreamland, so I'm in Oculus area. So like, I'm not in real Facebook. Like, let's be honest, I'm not over there. So like, I'm out there with like my VR headset, being like, let's make this better. Which is a totally different situation. So things I think can glide upward a little bit more easily when you're in a silo that's a little bit more nascent and a little bit more strange. But it is, and with that, a very ripe opportunity in that world to like push things further into the future in a way that is more effective because of the fact that like we're in this strange silo that is planning like what is potentially the future of social media. So there's a lot of us being at the forefront of it, being like, let's not make the old mistakes again. Let's just make things good, please, God.
Do you have the feeling that there's more of that awareness in there, oh, let's not make the same mistakes? And do you feel like we collectively and organizational learn and move forward? Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that it would. I mean, I can only speak to the ground level, and at that space, absolutely 100% yes, there are a lot of people who are moved to not make the same mistakes again.
Yeah, I think in academia the movement's a little slower, unfortunately. I think that largely has to do with the fact that, publishing a paper rarely results in a Cambridge Analytica level scandal. Right. And so those repercussions don't necessarily come back on you until something really, really big happens. Something like, CRISPR babies, or actually I work at the MIT Media Lab, so if anyone's familiar with that, it's only when you have scandals at that level that you really start to see pushback. But similarly, I think that, coming more from the ground level, especially from the younger generation of academia, we are starting to see people kind of push for more consideration of responsible design from the beginning. It's just definitely a little harder because the opinions of like grad students aren't necessarily valued as much as the opinions of like ground level Facebook employees.
Now, there's some more questions from the audience as well, like many. Loads. Joanne, if you want to.
Yeah, hi, my name is Joan, and I'm an undergraduate student at NYU, and I'm writing a thesis on political temporalities, focusing specifically on Afrofuturism. And I'm also from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we had a billboard go up last year that said, there are Black people in the future. And that was radical because, Black people are excluded actively and passively from being imagined in the future. I also think of Indigenous people and how, they're kind of like constrained to the past in, the construction of our identity. So I'm wondering if you can speak to equity in design, kind of more specifically related to people whose futures need to be kind of asserted with stronger.
Anyone wants to take that? Kelly, go ahead. Start. The other ones can jump in.
Well, I mean, I welcome that. The future of design, the future of technology is not going to be the Bay Area. It's going to be far, far more interesting places than that, to be honest. Well, it's going to be India. It's going to be China. It's going to be Nigeria. It's going to be a lot of tech companies talk about the next billion users, but I don't think that's still maintaining sort of hierarchy of we will create and you will consume, and I don't think that's necessarily very helpful. I am personally very interested in how do we bring radical inclusion into design, rather than just empathy, which is designing with other people in mind, which has significant limits. Paul Bloom, I think, has written about how we really struggle to empathize with people except people who are very much like us, or we find somehow attractive. And I think we have to find a way to dare I say, I know this is maybe a tricky term for a white guy to say, but decolonialize design in our technology industry, because it's got us into this state, and I don't think this state is particularly healthy. So I think other people should be helping to set the narrative for the future, not just us. But anyway, I feel somewhat under-equipped to answer that question, so I'll defer to the rest of the panel.
I can jump in with where I was going with some of the VR stuff. The intent of the paper that we wrote and the chapter we published was very much about trying to going and noticing that there were people who were considered edge cases in virtual reality, and we weren't bringing them along with us. And the realization that I worked in virtual reality and I was one of them, and I was like, well, no, not okay. I'm gonna try to at least point out what doesn't work about this technology now in order to hopefully have a more inclusive, more broad version of this technology in 5 or 10 years. And that was the intent there. And I do think that any time that we can notice any kind of group of people who is being left out of anything, if there's a way to point out why, broaden the understanding of that, and then move forward to help everyone understand why certain technologies can be exclusive and not inclusive, and then I think that knowledge helps us move forward.
Jordan, you've got more experience in terms of how to frame those conversations as well, and how to make them more accessible. What have been your learnings there in how to communicate? Because I believe quite a lot of those decisions, or even if we want to work together with more people, I think many implications of technologies are not well understood for the people we design for. So what are some learnings you have made in terms of framing those conversations and educating as you design as well?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely hard. So if you watch the progression of my YouTube videos from last summer until now, I'd like to think I've gotten better at it. But the earlier videos, you can definitely see that I struggle a bit to convey certain concepts, especially when you get into technical things or things like bias and inclusion. I think it's, first of all, just really important to improve tech literacy for everyone from the perspective of understanding the implications of new technology, because that's often one of the big barriers where people just don't know that they're being affected by these systems or don't understand them, and so they don't know to ask to be involved in the conversation, because a lot of the time it does end up being those people asking to be involved and not necessarily the people designing it reaching out. But I do think it needs to go both ways, and the people designing new tech need to make sure that they reach out to both, the people who are going to be using the product and the people who are going to be affected by the product, and that's often not the same demographic anyway. I think that in terms of, lessons I've learned from communication, coming from an academic background, we always present the methods first, and people don't care about the methods. Average people don't care about the methods. So leading with, why people should care is often the way that I approach it, and leading with it in a way that is, relatable. So I did a video recently on like AI reproducibility, and the thing that I compared it to was essentially that like I've been trying to make this one lemon bundt cake for probably about 5 years, and it never looks the same as the picture, but it also always is like raw in the middle and like fine on the outside, and I don't know why. And so when you try to, recreate other people's code or other people's products, the way that the circumstances around which you're creating that may result in a different product. And so I think that it's important to kind of think of these systems in that way and educate people on those systems in that way, because just because, someone originally designed something under certain constraints at a certain altitude with a certain oven or whatever, doesn't mean that everyone else is.
Yes, please.
More in the beginning of the conversation, there was a bunch of mentions of consent as a useful model in terms of sexual consent in the medical studies. I think what we've found in the data and information setting, though, is the consent or the notice and choice model really doesn't work, that it comes at the wrong point in the task where people are incented to say yes because they're trying to do something, but also the kind of the information asymmetry that they don't understand, how that data is going to be used, potentially misused, and I think that use of that model has sort of helped us get to the world that we're in with information warfare and disinformation and all that. And so I guess my question from a design perspective, how do you reconcile when models that are useful in one context are not so useful in another? So that's sort of a general question, and then the specific question is, what is design? How can design help in the sort of data and information space?
I can jump into that one to give you 2 examples that we used in the paper, just because I think that they're looking at consent a little bit more broadly and not just from the perspective of like, I hit okay and then therefore I consented. So we have 2 that are like kind of interesting cases that I really like to refer to, and one of them is we use the example of yes, no, maybe charts. I don't know if anyone is familiar with what that is. Is that just like a hard no from everybody? Cool. It's essentially like a procedure that you might do with a partner where you might list out every single thing that you were into, and this is like an intimate partner. You might list out everything that you were into doing, everything you were not into doing, and everything you might consider, just so that you have like a framework before anything happens, and you can still, like, things can still be playful. So we actually use that as the model for the granular settings that we think that designers should put into the beginning of any social virtual reality experience. So that being before you go out into the world in social VR, before you actually interact with other users, you should set up parameters for the types of experience that you're willing to have. So how close can other users get to you? Who can see your name? Really basic things just to lay the groundwork so that you feel like you have an experience that you have controlled and that you understand before you actually get there. So that's like one example of how we used it. And another one is we looked at clinical trials that were done with deaf and hard of hearing participants in the rule system that the National Institute of Health had made for that suggests specific parameters for gestural consent inputs and like procedures for receiving ongoing like enthusiastic consent throughout a trial. And we use that to be able to design sort of quick action exit gestures for like high pressure situations in virtual reality. So if something bad happens to you, you shouldn't have to go 7 layers deep in your menu while someone's physically, literally harassing you. You should just be able to be like, and then you're gone. So things like that. It's a little bit broader than like the OK button. It's just like we went deep. We found every possible example of consent and just like tried and actually experimented with applying all of them.
Sure. Okay. Andrew.
Yeah, so as a product manager, I live in the world of Agile most of the time, and I'm a huge fan of this idea of thinking through the potential ethical consequences of something before you ship it, bringing in these ethical conversations into the ideation stage. At the same time, a lot of the frameworks I've seen for incorporating ethics considerations into ideation are more theoretical or hypothetical. They're sort of frameworks that happen around a conference table or on a whiteboard.
I'm wondering if any of you have seen examples of ways to actually test, in an agile sense, test the ethical consequences of something before you scale it. Like we mentioned, a lot of the issues happen when you scale it, so it seems like there might be a challenge of collecting these learnings and data in a non-hypothetical setting on how your technology might affect people before you actually scale it out to a place where it can do widespread harm.
Well, if I may, I'll pick that up. For me, this is where speculative design really has value as a moral tool, because you can create a design fiction, a prototype of a potential future for this technology, and bring people in and test that, right? Test it as if it were just, it's not a product release. You're not saying this is good design, but it contains enough potentiae, if you like, of that technology that it will allow people to, once they feel it and play with it and sort of, say, well, what would it be like if the technology does end up like this? That brings out a lot of those consequences, I think. People, rather than forcing them to have like a thought experiment type, well, it could do this, it could do this. If you actually say, here's a thing, in 10 years' time, maybe it can do a retina scan and give you access to these things, people then immediately start to have quite what's the word I'm looking for? Well, quite immediate reactions to that. So yeah, this is me. This is what I see as this idea of creating that sort of wormhole to that potential future and bringing that to the now so that you can get that. Yeah.
Any other? That's all right. That's done. Back there.
Hi. On that speculative design, how do you actually, what are the metrics to measure the ethical impact?
I won't go into my metricsy rant here, but I don't believe you can.
So how can you measure what's, like, if something has an ethical impact, is it just speculative in an imaginary world?
Especially if you can't test it 10 years out.
Well, that's a positivist perspective, and that's part of the problem, right? This is one of the reasons we are in this situation, is that we believe that the only meaningful progress is that which can be measured. And the metricization of business has caused so many ethical shortcuts to be taken that I question that very premise.
But as you pointed out, that's not actual science. And as a scientist, I can say that, we might think we understand how something works, and then 5 or 10 years down the line, we realize it's not quite what we thought, because we conducted randomized clinical trials, because we did science. We took the best that science has to offer us, with all of its problems as well. But the timeline, the time course of science is completely different than the time course of technological design. So how do we take the best of both? I think throwing out metrics isn't the answer, frankly. What do we do?
We're never going to throw out metrics. What we need is people like me who will complain about metrics sufficiently that at least there's contestation of that.
Metrics and you're poo-pooing science, it sounded like, for a second. So what do we do?
Oh, I have a science degree. I mean, my background is science.
Right.
I'm currently reading a book about mixed methods research. For those who are not familiar, it's kind of the mixing of qual and quant in research. And I think there are still ways we can get data that is valuable, that helps shape product strategy and design, that is qualitative as well as quantitative. I think if we're looking for quantitative measures of ethical perspectives on things that may happen in 10 years' time, that's not possible. I don't believe that's something we can get with any accuracy. I do believe we can get qualitative feedback on that.
Why? That's the standard of science, to have quantitative metrics. Why do you think it's not possible?
This is a philosophical question there, and I would defer to a real ethicist on that. But for me, ethics is about experience. It's about, to an extent, human subjectivity and emotion, as much as it is anything verifiable or objective. So,
I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist, and I study emotion, and I study anxiety, and I study the brain and behavior and subjectivity. And the past 20 years of my career has been devoted to the idea that maybe we can measure something that can translate into benefit for humanity. Well, so that's why I think I'm pushing you a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Well, I look forward to reading your research and you proving me wrong then, because I would not claim to be an expert in those topics, and you are. So, yeah, that sounds great. I'm delighted you're doing that work, genuinely.
Let's instead of metrics.
Sorry, what?
So instead of saying our goal is to have a metric, the goal is to find ways to evaluate.
I'm not understanding, sorry.
Or we can...
Let's chat it offline.
In order to determine the ethical impact.
The potential ethical impact, I'm not a researcher here to be clear, but I'd be looking for stories. I'd be looking for not anecdotes, I mean structured patterns in people's visceral responses and their vocalizations of concerns they have about that technology and its socio-cultural implications. I'd be looking for mental models that people have around that technology and so on. I think that data is still valuable and can be collected in a structured manner. As I say, it's the quant stuff is where I've maybe got a blind spot perhaps, yeah.
I think there's quite a lot of knowledge to share in there. I think in science itself, you also have the qualitative, quantitative discussions, and you have different epistemology, different routes in there. And I think there's the same discussion in there, and I think we can really learn a lot if we look into that one. The question, like not looking 10 years into the future to wrap up, maybe it's just like looking for 1 year in the future. Maybe one thought of you next year at All Tech is Human, what are we going to talk about? What would you think what's there? Maybe you've got an idea. Just to, whoever wants to go first, just like.
We're trying to leave this on a positive vibe. Yeah.
As you want. You can go negative and then it's positive next year, so you can be very happy about that one.
I fear that the next couple of years we're going to see a more mainstream instance of something terrible happening in virtual reality. That is something that I'm not looking forward to. I know is coming. But my positive note on that is like, myself and a lot of people that I know are trying to get ahead of it. And you can too. Jump on, get on this, be part of it.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a positive or a negative, but in terms of this time next year, I think we're still going to be having this discussion. I don't think it's a discussion that ever ends. I don't necessarily think that we're going to make significant progress on it between now and next year, but I think that it's a discussion that should go on for as long as possible because we're always going to be designing things and we should always be doing it responsibly.
I think, yeah, we'll probably be having this exact same conversation next year, but hopefully with a little bit more sophistication, probably on my part as well. I think also the trend that's really interesting me, and I think that the tech industry is really having to grapple with, is the interplay between ethics and politics. The ethical discourse is becoming increasingly politicized within tech firms, and as such, I think easily dismissed as politics, and people fall into, oh, well, that's just leftist ranting, or that's just right-wing trolling, or whatever it might be. How do we push past that and make ethics an important point of discourse wherever you sit on the political spectrum? I think is something we're really going to have to challenge over the next couple of years.
That's good. Let's thank you very much, and let's look forward to